What is art? Or what makes art art? In this lecture video, I'm going to be presenting Arthur Danto's article, The Artworld, where he tries to explain that, well, what makes art art is the fact that it exists within an art world. It makes sense only by a whole kind of art theory, a kind of context in which it occurs relating to previous art theories and transitions in what he calls the art world. Now, the ancient Greek theory of art is based on the idea of mimesis. Now, mimesis in Greek, it just means kind of imitation. Now, according to them, works of art are representations or imitations of that which is more real. So if you have a painting, right, it's really based on that which is more, a painting of a tree, that which is more real, the real tree, right? That is what art is. It imitates reality. We see this very clearly in Plato's book, The Republic, in Book 10. Here, Socrates says to Glaucon, or asks the question, then consider this very point. What does painting do in each case? Does it imitate that which is as it is, or does it imitate that which appears as it appears? Is it an imitation of appearances or of truth? And we should say what's behind this is this whole idea between the distinction of appearance and reality. Now, Glaucon responds by saying, well, a painting is based on appearances. It imitates appearances. It doesn't imitate truth. And so Socrates says, then imitation is far removed from the truth, for it touches only a small part of each thing, and a part that is itself only an image. And that, it seems, is why it can produce everything. For example, we say that a painter can paint a cobbler, a carpenter, or any other craftsman, even though he knows nothing about these crafts. Nevertheless, if he is a good painter and displays his painting of a carpenter at a distance, he can deceive children and foolish people into thinking that it is truly a carpenter. So there's this kind of skepticism and a kind of almost disdain towards art in this Book 10 of the Republic by Socrates here, because this idea is, well, artists, they imitate the world as it is, except for the fact that, well, artists only have contact with the world as it appears because they don't have philosophical truth, of necessary truth. Only truth is that which is necessary. It couldn't be otherwise. So artists are painting appearances. And if art is imitation, then an appearance is kind of, in a way, an imitation of the truth, right? We say it's how it appears. It's less than perfect. It's a perspective, maybe. And so in this case, art is an imitation of imitation. And we see then how people can take maybe a poetry, a piece of artwork, a sculpture, whatever else, right? They can take that for the truth. They can mistake it because of the fact that, well, once it's an imitation of an imitation, it kind of becomes its own thing in a sense, and it's unreliable. Now, we can see how maybe this imitation theory of art view is in the case of this statue of Socrates, right? The statue is, in a sense, it's based on the real Socrates. It's meant to imitate him, to represent him. Then we have this other Chinese painting here. We have this person on top of this kind of cliff. And we have trees, so we have, in a sense, mountain. It looks like fog. Now, of course, this painting is based on imitations of fog, imitations of a mountain, imitations of trees, of a person, and so on and so forth. So what makes this art? Well, it's representing the things that are actually in the real world. Mountains, humans, trees, and so on and so forth. But Danto thinks that there are limitations with the imitation theory of art. He sees this when he quotes Hamlet, where Hamlet recognizes that imitation through reflecting surfaces like mirrors, or maybe even reflecting surface in the sense of, still water, that they reveal us to ourselves. They show us what we could not otherwise perceive. In a way, it's a kind of new perspective of the world as it actually is, maybe ourselves as we really are. What is the limit of art? So how far does this idea that art is imitation, how far can it extend? How expansive of a definition is this of a theory of art? Well, if a mirror is an imitation, and we say, of course, that, well, art is imitation, then that would mean mirror images are art. Seeing myself in the reflection, in the morning as I'm brushing my teeth or, whatever else, it's art. Art apparently is occurring right in front of me. For Danto, he thinks that this is way too expansive of a definition then to say that these all mirror images necessarily are art because they're imitations. Now, maybe one might want to bite the bullet and say, no, it's still art, or maybe it can be art. But the point is, to say that art is imitation is to expand beyond things which we would say require an artist, perhaps. So he thinks that what has actually arisen in art is this contemporary distinction between illustration and art, where now artists speak of an illustration as an imitation or a representation of the world as it is. That is compared to art, which is more of maybe an expression. An expression isn't just an imitation of how things are. It's really maybe what we want to show, what we want to tell about the world, how it actually isn't, or what the world could be, what we should dream for, what we should hope for. If there's this distinction now, why does that mean that, well, in some cases illustration maybe is like less art than art itself if real art is an expression? What really is art? What gets to determine what really is art? So Danto wants to shift our perspective in a similar way that the history of science has kind of undergone a kind of perspective over how science exists. Now, this whole idea of science as kind of linear progress isn't really true. It's undertaken what we can call paradigm shifts. These paradigm shifts where you have this one dominant theory of how science should be. Eventually, some people start to get results which maybe don't necessarily cohere with the dominant theory, and over time, then that theory is kind of replaced by a new one, and so on and so forth. And so we kind of have this view of science as kind of these paradigm shifts of how science maybe can operate, new kind of facts about the world. And this isn't the case of, think of Einstein, right? Einstein's theory of relativity kind of overturns much of the more, I don't want to really phrase it this way, but the more basic kind of Newtonian physics, right? Now, that doesn't mean that, that's not science, the Newtonian physics and how it makes sense of the world, but it's inadequate for new breakthroughs in science. Now, Danto wants to ask, can we think of art in a similar way as having undertaken dominant conceptual revolutions? And he sees this with the imitation theory of art, and then moving towards what he thinks is a new kind of dominant interpretation, conceptual interpretation of art through, kind of expressionism, I guess, more broadly. Now, he thinks there are, of course, sub-conceptions of the imitation theory of art. There's competing theories about what exactly the imitation theory of art entails. So he doesn't dismiss that there are also revolutions within the imitation theory of art itself, but he's just looking at this kind of macro perspective, and he sees, well, just for the sake of argument, we can see that a lot of artists now don't agree with the imitation theory of art. Maybe now they agree with what he calls the RT theory, that artists do not imitate real forms, but create new ones. So whereas according to the imitation theory of art, an artist imitates a form, so the form of, that which is the most real. But instead, this new theory of RT is that, well, artists actually create new forms. They create new realities. What might that do for us? Well, an example he gives of someone that does this, that creates new realities, that isn't merely imitating the world as it actually is Van Gogh's Potato Eaters. He thinks in this case we can see Van Gogh's not attempting to, kind of show what it's like to eat a potato and have a family gathered around, but he's trying to tell a story of something that actually doesn't really exist in the world as it actually is. Take Lichtenstein's pop art, for example. This isn't an imitation of something in the real world. It's not an imitation of human beings or things like that. It's a kind of expression of something, in a sense, worldly, but also otherworldly. Think of the POW in this pop art, that doesn't really exist, but it's kind of almost giving us a sense of maybe if we could see sounds as words and things like this, right? Narrating a kind of new way to conceive of the world. That isn't just an imitation of how the world actually is. Similarly, in the case of Jasper John's paintings. So of this, Danto says, Lichtenstein's then are not imitations. So with the pop art, these are not just imitations, but new entities as giant whelks would be. And then Jasper John's, by contrast, he says, paints objects with respect to which questions of scale are irrelevant. Yet, his objects cannot be imitations, for they have the remarkable property that any intended copy of a member of this class of objects is automatically a member of the class itself, so that these objects are logically inimitable. They can't be imitated, because a new imitation of that object is just a new object. Thus, he says, a copy of a numeral just is that numeral. A painting of 3 is a 3 made of paint. John's, in addition, paints targets, flags, and maps. He doesn't paint imitations of targets, flags, and maps. He actually paints targets, flags, and maps. And think about this for a second, right? What Danto's saying is that it's not the case that, okay, let's say I'm typing in a Word document and I copy the number 3, paste it. It's not the case that I've imitated the number 3. I've just made a new 3. And that's what Danto is trying to say about this new theory. It's not a kind of imitation of the number 3. It's not an imitation of flags. It's not an imitation of people gathered around eating potatoes. It's kind of a new reality, a new expression of existence. Now, if then art makes new reality, we often talk about, for example, maybe someone in the distance, they might see a statue or something like that, right? And they might mistake that statue for a real person. Well, if we're saying that art is a new reality that's created, can one mistake reality for reality in the way that we might say, well, one can mistake art for reality? Danto says, well, one can mistake a flat surface for a bed, insofar as they see maybe just it turns out it's like a table and there's like a blanket draped over it, and maybe it's a low table, right? And they think, oh, there's a bed over here, I'm going to lay on it. And then they go to lay on it and they realize, oh, this is just like a piece of wood on top of stuff right here. This isn't actually a bed. But can we say that one can mistake a bed for a bed painting? In thinking about mistaking art for reality, Danto says that kind of a question, right, and this is meant to defend this new kind of art theory, that artists don't just imitate reality but create new forms of reality. Danto says this idea that we can mistake art for reality is a kind of philosophical problem. It's about what we think we are mistaking, and he wants to show that what we think we're mistaking is wrong. It's a misconception about what art is, really. He says artworks must then be taken as irreducible parts of themselves and are in that sense primitive. Or, more accurately, the paint streaks on a painting of, let's say, a bed, are not part of the real object, the bed, which happens to be part of the artwork, but are, like the bed, part of the artwork as such. Not every part of an artwork, A, is part of a real object, R, when R is part of A, and can, moreover, be detached from A and seen merely as R. So it's a mistake then in this kind of a way where we don't think of, a painting as containing parts of the bed when we talk about imitating the bed. It's completely a different thing. That, yeah, we might mistake a piece of art for reality, but we're not mistaking it as a piece of art. We're just mistaking about what we thought this kind of a particular bed was. That's all. He furthermore gives this example here. He illustrates, it's just these two blocks. It's supposed to be two different kinds of paintings. And he says, so imagine two painters are asked to decorate the east and west walls of a science library with frescoes to be respectively called Newton's first law and Newton's third law. These paintings, when finally unveiled, look, scale apart, as follows. As objects, I shall suppose the works to be indiscernible. A black horizontal line on a white ground, equally large in each dimension and element. Now the painter B explains his work as follows. It's a mass pressing downward, which is met by a mass pressing upward. The lower mass reacts equally and oppositely to the upper one, right? It's meant to reflect Newton's third law in this case. Now, painter A, though, explains his work as follows. The line through the space is the path of an isolated particle. The path goes from edge to edge to give the sense of its going beyond. If it ended or began within the space, the line would be curved, and it is parallel to the top and bottom edges. For if it were closer to one than to another, there would have to be a force accounting for it, and this is inconsistent with its being the path of an isolated particle. Now, these paintings seem indiscernible, but now that you've been given this description about how to interpret it, how to make sense of what this is, are they indiscernible? Can't you see in each one what it is? You can only see that these are two different paintings by knowing the explanation, by knowing the kind of theory of the case of the art, of what it's meant to portray. You only know that, well, A is a representation perhaps of Newton's first law and B of Newton's third law because maybe you have an understanding of the art world. You have an understanding of the theory behind it. Now take those, the two white blocks, the black line before it. Let's say the painter said of the artwork, this is black paint and white paint and nothing more. Danto asks, is this a tautology or is this something meaningful? Now he thinks actually it's not a tautology, right? A tautology would be a truism. It's true no matter what, and therefore, nothing can be true no matter what. It has for it to be true, it has to be a possibility that it could be false. Otherwise, you're basically saying nothing. Danto says, well, if a painter said this, that this is black paint and white paint and nothing more, it's not a tautology. If that was exactly what the painter painted, was trying to portray, just saying this is black paint and white paint and nothing more isn't just to say it's black paint and white paint and nothing more. It's to say, don't interpret it as something else. It's not a representation of Newton's first law. It's not a representation of Newton's third law. So already then you're starting to make sense of the art because it's not all those other things. So Danto says a given identification determines how many elements the work is to contain. Right? So we have this identification that it's a black paint and white paint, nothing more. Maybe, the explanation of it being Newton's third law, right? We can talk about the other kind of elements the work is meant to contain. And Danto says this then makes different identifications incompatible with one another. That you can't think of that painting as both the first law and third law at the same time. They're incompatible with one another because of the explanations of what's going on with that black line or the white boxes in that painting. And you can think of this as maybe similar to the, the duck rabbit drawing. You can think of that as either a duck or a rabbit. You can't think of it at the same time. Now, he does think that there are senseless identifications in a painting. So, for example, one can't read the horizontal line of the two white blocks, the black line between them, as perhaps the book or illustration of the book Where the Crawdads Sing. It doesn't map onto it enough. There's not enough there that could represent what's going on in Where the Crawdads Sing. So there can, again, be, it's not just a kind of like relativism that Danto is arguing here. What he's arguing is that what makes art art is not that it imitates the world as it is, and it's not the RT theory. It's not art. What makes art art isn't that it creates new realities. It is the art world. It's that it's enmeshed within a kind of theory behind it. He says to see something as art requires something the eye cannot decry. It requires an atmosphere of artistic theory, which is why the only reason you can see a piece of art with just two white blocks on top of each other with a black line separating them, where the artist says this is black paint and white paint and nothing more. There is something more. It's saying more than that. And you only know that on the background knowledge of a kind of theory of art behind it. Look at these examples here of Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain and Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. Danto says, what in the end makes the difference between a Brillo box and a work of art consisting of a Brillo box is a certain theory of art. It is the theory that takes it up into the world of art and keeps it from collapsing into the real object which it is. Of course, without the theory, one is unlikely to see it as art, and in order to see it as part of the art world, one must have mastered a good deal of artistic theory, as well as a considerable amount of the history of recent New York painting. He's talking, right, in this case, of Andy Warhol. It could not have been 50 years ago, it could not have been art 50 years ago. So 50 years, prior to the Brillo boxes. So maybe, let's say 1900, if someone did that, it wouldn't have been considered art. But he said, then again, there could not have been, everything equal, flight insurance in the Middle Ages or Etruscan typewriter erasers. The world has to be ready for certain things. The art world no less than the real one. So take Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain. Is this art? Right? He just takes this factory-made urinal, slaps the name R. Mutt 1917 on it, kind of repositions the urinal almost kind of upside down, or at perhaps maybe a 90-degree angle. Is that art? If you just saw that, would you think that was art? But what if you know behind it that, well, it's a kind of protest of the kind of, manufacturing of, regurgitating ready-made art that you can just go buy at any store that is, maybe makes 1,000 of the things. Thing of, when you go to Walmart, right, and you can buy the kind of ready-made art to put up on the walls. And so maybe this is meant to protest that, right? It's a kind of expression of that. Now that you know that, do you see it then as art? Or take maybe the same thing with the Brillo boxes. If you have a sense of kind of what's going on among artists in maybe the 1950s and 1960s in New York City, and then you come to see these painted Brillo boxes, does that allow you then to see it as art as compared to if you didn't know about that beforehand? This idea of the art world, Danto thinks, allows him to create a model for how we can understand art beyond what we know now. So he says the greater variety of artistically relevant predicates, the more complex the individual members of the art world become. And the more one knows of the entire population of the art world, the richer one's experience with any of its members. So he has this graph here, right? We have F and G. He says let G be representational and let F be expressionist. So maybe G is like the imitation theory and F is the expressionist theory. He says at a given time, these and their opposites are perhaps the only art-relevant predicates in critical use. Now, letting plus stand for a given predicate P and minus for its opposite non-P, we may construct a style matrix more or less as follows. So kind of how we interpret a piece of art. So basically all we have knowledge of is this idea of art as imitation or representation and art as expression or creating new real objects, new realities, let's say. Now let's say we view a piece of art, okay? And so we want to view it horizontally. Now he says the rows determine available styles given the active critical vocabulary. So let's say maybe, right, F is expressionist, G is representational. So maybe that first line, we have a positive account of both representationalism and expressionism. Maybe this allows us to see a kind of a new style of art called representational expressionistic. He calls it, maybe it's fauvism. Maybe in the next line, right, where pro-expressionism, anti-representationalism, well, maybe we have representational non-expressionistic, Ingress. Or then the next line, non-representational expressionistic, and we could call this abstract expressionism. Or maybe in the last line, non-representational non-expressionist, hard edge abstraction, right? We can see these kind of different interpretations based on these different theorists allow us to think of art in different ways. So he says plainly, as we add art-relevant predicates, we increase the number of available styles at the rate of 2n. So artistic breakthroughs, he says, occur by adding the possibility of a column to the matrix. If we have a new theory, now then we have to double. No longer 4 lines, we have to have 8 lines. We have all, twice as many possible, at least twice as many possible interpretations or different styles that can result because of now we have knowledge of these different theories of art. And so how is it that we can see different paintings, sculptures, whether it be a Brillo box or whatever else, as art? Only in the background of art theory and a whole history of art theory, what he calls the art world. I think a good question, though, to ask about this theory of the art world is, would it say that AI-generated artwork is art? Would we say that which, you can type in, for AI to come up with some picture, right? Well, when it comes up with that picture, is that art? What would be required for it to be considered art, according to the art world theory? And this, what I have here is just a representation of, there was actually an award, a first place award given to AI-generated art, ahead of all the other human artists. And there was actually a great deal of backlash by those human artists that this AI-generated art could be given first place for its beauty as a work of art. So is AI-generated artwork art?